Nicole Kidman has made her first public appearance since her split from Keith Urban.
We've been through a lot together.
We've got a timeline for it now, and the time it's now.
After nearly 2 decades together.
For 18 years, they were the couple nobody expected to last, and yet somehow they did. A country music star still fighting his own demons. An Oscar-winning actress who had already walked away from one very public Hollywood marriage. Together, Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman built something that felt genuinely rare in an industry that treats relationships as temporary arrangements. But now, after the divorce that stunned millions of fans around the world, Urban is finally speaking. And what he is saying about Nicole Kidman, about who she really was behind closed doors, about what she carried quietly so that he could survive, changes the entire story. Not just theirs, but the one the public thought they already knew. There is a particular kind of silence that follows the end of a long marriage. Not the loud, dramatic silence of a public feud or a courtroom battle, but something quieter and harder to explain. The kind that settles in when two people who genuinely tried, who built rituals and rules and real effort around staying together, finally reach a point where trying is no longer enough. That is the silence that followed Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman's separation. No explosive headlines. No competing media narratives. Just the slow, heavy confirmation that something most people had believed in for nearly 2 decades had finally come to an end. What made the public reaction so intense was not simply the news of the divorce itself. It was the collision between that news and the image people had spent years building around this couple in their minds. Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman were not just famous people who happened to be married. For a long time, they represented something people genuinely wanted to believe existed in Hollywood. A relationship that had been tested early, survived its worst moment, and come out stronger on the other side. When that belief was shattered, people did not just mourn the marriage. They went looking for answers. And the answers, when they finally came from Urban himself, were more honest and more complicated than most people were prepared to hear. To understand what Urban eventually revealed, you first have to understand who he was before Nicole Kidman ever entered his life. Because the man she married in June 2006 was not simply a successful country musician with a Grammy on his shelf and a devoted fan base. He was someone who had spent years managing a version of himself that looked stable on the outside while carrying something much more difficult underneath. Urban grew up in Queensland, Australia, raised in a household where country music was not background noise but a way of life. His father was deeply passionate about American country records, and that passion transferred to his son almost immediately. By the time Urban was still a young child, he was already performing in local talent competitions and developing a technical ability on the guitar that separated him from most kids his age. Music was never a hobby for him. It was the thing around which everything else was organized. When he eventually made the decision to move to Nashville in the early 90s, it was not impulsive. It was the logical next step for someone who had been preparing for it his entire life. But Nashville did not open its doors easily. His first years there were financially difficult, professionally discouraging, and eventually led to a return to Australia after the initial attempt did not take hold. He went back. He rebuilt. And when he returned to Nashville for a second time, things moved differently. Recording contracts followed. Grammy nominations arrived. A fan base grew around his voice and his guitar work in ways that had seemed impossible during those early struggling years. But underneath all of that momentum, something else was happening. Urban had developed a dependency on alcohol and cocaine that he would later describe not as a casual excess but as a genuine addiction. He entered rehabilitation twice during those years. And here is the part that matters most when you try to understand everything that came later. By his own account, those early rehabilitation attempts were not really about confronting the addiction honestly. They were about managing the appearance of recovery. Going in, doing the work that was visible, and returning to life without truly addressing what was driving the problem in the first place. He looked sober. He functioned. He believed, or at least told himself, that he had handled enough of it to move forward. But the foundation was not as solid as it appeared, and eventually that reality could not stay hidden. Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban met in January 2005 at the Day USA Gala in Los Angeles, an event designed to celebrate Australians working in international entertainment. Kidman later admitted openly that she was immediately drawn to him. Urban, by her account, barely seemed to register it. He did not reach out for nearly 4 months after that first meeting. When he finally did call, the pace of the relationship changed almost instantly. They moved quickly, and by May 2006 they were engaged. On June 25 of that year, they were married in a candlelit ceremony at a chapel in Sydney, surrounded by close friends and family, with Kidman's children from her previous marriage also present. By every outward account, the atmosphere was warm, intimate, and genuinely joyful. In October 2006, Urban entered the Betty Ford Center for treatment related to alcohol addiction. He stayed for approximately 3 months. The marriage, which had only just begun, was immediately placed under a pressure that most relationships would not survive even after years of being established. Kidman responded in a way that, at the time, was noted but perhaps not fully understood by the public. She quietly canceled press commitments she had for an upcoming film. She stepped away from interviews. She did not speak publicly about what was happening. Instead, she simply remained present, rearranging her professional life to be available to her husband while he confronted something he had been avoiding for years. There were no statements designed to manage headlines. No carefully worded responses through a publicist. Just a choice, made privately, to stay and to show up. Urban would later describe that period as the moment he came closest to losing everything that mattered to him outside of music. And the fact that Kidman chose to remain, not because it was easy, but despite every reason she might have had to walk away, became something he carried forward through everything that followed. In June 2024, Nicole Kidman was honored at the AFI Life Achievement Award Gala in Hollywood, a formal celebration of her decades-long career in film. The evening brought together actors, directors, and longtime collaborators who had worked with her across her career. Tribute speeches were delivered. Stories were shared. The atmosphere was designed as a warm, professional celebration of her contributions to the industry. What he delivered was not a polished tribute carefully written to sound moving. It was something closer to a confession. Standing in front of an audience of industry figures and cameras that would later carry his words across the world, Urban spoke openly about the beginning of their marriage in a way he had never done publicly before. He acknowledged that only months after their wedding, addictions he had spent years avoiding truly confronting nearly destroyed the relationship before it had any real chance to grow. He described entering treatment with no certainty that the marriage would survive. He spoke about that period without minimizing it or reshaping it into something easier to revisit. He described Nicole Kidman as someone who had made a deliberate choice during the hardest moment of his life. A choice to push through every reason she had to leave, every outside voice suggesting she should walk away, and every doubt that must have existed inside her own mind. He spoke about her with a depth of gratitude that made it clear he did not view what she had done as simply loyalty or patience. He viewed it as the reason he was still standing. Cameras captured Kidman wiping away tears while the room stayed almost completely quiet. By the following morning, the speech had traveled across social media and entertainment platforms around the world, and the response from audiences was unusually genuine. People were moved not because the moment had been crafted for publicity but because it clearly had not been. It felt like something real being said out loud for the first time. But while audiences responded to the emotional honesty of Urban's tribute, something else was happening beneath the surface of it. The speech, in laying bare how difficult the early years of the marriage had genuinely been, also made visible just how much effort had been required to keep the relationship intact across all the years that followed. Urban and Kidman had not simply survived the 2006 crisis and moved on to an easy life together. What came after was a long and deliberate process of rebuilding. Not just trust, but the shared rhythms and agreements that could hold a marriage together when both people were constantly being pulled in different directions by careers that demanded significant time and travel. Urban spent long stretches on the road touring. Kidman filmed on location in different countries. The separations were real, the schedules were demanding, and neither of those things simplified with time. Both of them spoke at different points over the years about the specific agreements they had built around the marriage. They had a rule about not allowing extended time apart without reconnecting in person. Urban developed a habit of calling Kidman during concerts, from backstage during encore breaks, to check in and stay connected even in the middle of a touring schedule. Kidman made her own adjustments, stepping away from certain projects when family demanded more of her attention. Sunday Rose, born in 2008, and Faith Margaret, born in 2010, added a new dimension to the balancing act both of them were already managing. These were not small things. They were the kind of daily structural choices that do not get photographed or turned into headlines but that ultimately determine whether a relationship survives the years or quietly unravels inside them. And for a long time, those choices worked. The marriage held. But Urban's speech, honest as it was, also carried inside it an acknowledgement that holding something together through deliberate effort is a different thing from it holding naturally. And that distinction, once noticed, changes how you look at everything that followed. The years following the Betty Ford crisis were defined by effort and intention, but they were never free from pressure. Urban's history with addiction remained a permanent part of the emotional landscape of the marriage, not as an active crisis but as a presence. Recovery does not have an endpoint. It is a continuous adjustment, and both he and Kidman had spent years navigating the emotional weight of that reality alongside everything else they were managing. Even in stable periods, awareness of what had almost been lost does not simply disappear. It shapes how a relationship is understood, how carefully certain things are handled, and how much internal energy is quietly spent on maintenance that other couples might not need. There were also external pressures that added complexity to the image of the marriage from early on. In 2006, during Urban's rehabilitation period, a model named Amanda Wyatt gave interviews claiming a prior relationship with Urban that she suggested had overlapped with his engagement to Kidman. The claims were never confirmed or addressed publicly by either Urban or Kidman, and they were never substantiated in any legal setting. But they circulated widely enough in tabloid coverage to become part of the early public narrative around the marriage, a cloud that sat at the edges of a relationship still in its first year. None of this alone would have been enough to end what they had built. But over time, the combined weight of prolonged distance, the emotional demands of careers that never slowed down, and the quiet exhaustion of maintaining a relationship through structure rather than ease began to accumulate. Not all at once. Gradually. The way most long-term relationships that end do not break suddenly but instead slowly stop resembling what they once were. By 2025, the signs had become difficult to ignore for those paying close attention. Urban and Kidman were being seen separately more frequently. The visible rhythm of reconnection they had once made a point of maintaining began to look inconsistent. Industry observers and people close to them later described the shift not as a single dramatic turning point but as a prolonged withdrawal from the shared patterns that had once defined how their life together functioned. When the separation was confirmed publicly, the response was immediate and widespread. For many people, the news required a genuine rethinking of the belief they had held for years that this particular couple had already survived their worst chapter. The assumption had been that a marriage which endured the early addiction crisis, rebuilt itself on deliberate structure, and lasted nearly 2 decades must have found a way to make it permanent. The divorce challenged that assumption in a way that was uncomfortable for a public that had invested emotionally in what Urban and Kidman represented. Urban spoke afterward with a brevity and quietness that matched the tone of the divorce itself. He did not place blame or attempt to construct a simple explanation. What he described was something closer to gradual drift. 2 lives moving in different directions for long enough that the distance between them became structural rather than temporary. Exhaustion was the word that seemed to sit beneath everything he said. Not dramatic collapse. Not a single wound. Just the accumulated weight of years of effort finally reaching a point where it was no longer sustainable. Both parents made clear that their daughters remained the priority, and the separation itself was handled without the public conflict that often accompanies high-profile divorces. There were no competing media narratives. No extended legal disputes played out in headlines. Just a quiet and deliberate ending to a chapter that had been defined, from its very first months, by the same quality. Effort over ease, structure over instinct, and a conscious choice each day to hold on. What Keith Urban ultimately revealed about Nicole Kidman was not a scandal or a rewriting of history. It was something quieter and more significant than that. He told the world, in plain language and in public, that she had chosen him at a moment when choosing him was genuinely difficult. That she had absorbed a crisis she had not created, reorganized her life around his recovery, and stayed present when absence would have been easier and entirely understandable. That truth did not change the outcome. The marriage still ended. But it did change something about how the story is understood. Because what Urban described was not a perfect relationship or an effortless love story. It was a real one, complicated from the beginning, sustained through deliberate work, and shaped by choices made during moments of genuine difficulty. And perhaps that is the most honest thing either of them ever allowed the public to see. Not a fairy tale that was disrupted, but a human story, built carefully, maintained with intention, and ultimately subject to the same limits that all human things eventually reach. What do you take away from Urban's honesty about everything Nicole Kidman quietly carried during their marriage? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this story worth your time, leave a like and subscribe. There is more coming that you will not want to miss.